105 hours before her lethal injection, a former therapist whispered to her lawyer, "I'm not afraid. I know where I'm going." But was she ever given a fair trial? This isn't just a story about a brutal murder. It's a story about America's justice system, about one woman's final hours on death row, and about questions that still haunt us today. Kimberly McCarthy's life before the final 105 hours. Saturday, June 22nd, and 2013. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy, aged 52, was moved to death watch in the Huntsville Walls Unit, Texas. She had spent the previous 11 years on death row. Now, with less than 105 hours remaining in her life, the countdown had begun. But to understand those final hours, we must look further back, to a life that began with promise and ended in tragedy. Kimberly McCarthy was born in 1961 in Greenville, Texas. She trained as an occupational therapist, and by the late 1980s, she was working in nursing homes across Dallas County, helping elderly patients regain their strength after strokes and injuries. In the early 1990s, she married Aaron Michaels, founder of the New Black Panther Party. The couple had one son, but as public life brought its own pressures, private struggles grew. By the mid-1990s, court records and testimonies would later reveal Kimberly was battling a worsening addiction to crack cocaine. In 1995, she left her position at Sunset Manor Nursing Center. By 1997, she faced mounting debts, over $847 in unpaid utility bills. Her landlord had filed for eviction. An eviction hearing was scheduled for August 15th, though. Her phone had been disconnected, friends had distanced themselves. At age 30, Kimberly was living alone in a rented house on Mockingbird Lane in Lancaster, a quiet suburb south of Dallas. 20 feet away, in the house next door, lived Dorothy Booth, a 71-year-old retired psychology professor from El Centro College. Dorothy led a disciplined life, morning walks, afternoon reading, and weekly trips to the grocery store. Neighbors described her as helpful, thoughtful, and always polite. In that summer of 1997, their paths would cross in the most tragic way imaginable. But as we begin this story, it is vital to remember. On the morning of July 21st, 1997, just before 7 a.m., Kimberly McCarthy had not yet become a killer. She was, at that moment, a woman desperate, a woman addicted, a woman on the edge of losing everything. And that desperation would soon cross a line from which there was no return. July 21st, 1997, the day Kimberly McCarthy crossed the line. It was a sweltering Monday morning, July 21st, 1997. The Texas sun had already pushed the temperature past 90 degrees by mid-morning. At precisely 10:47 in the morning, Kimberly McCarthy made a phone call to her next-door neighbor, 71-year-old Dorothy Booth. The request was simple, almost quaint. "Could I borrow some sugar?" Mrs. Booth, ever gracious, said yes. But beneath that innocent exchange, a desperate calculus was unfolding. Kimberly McCarthy was broke, addicted, and facing eviction. She owed money. She needed crack cocaine. And across the yard, in that modest home, lived an elderly woman she believed could be an easy target. Witnesses would later testify. Kimberly had no intention of simply borrowing sugar that day. She entered Booth's home carrying a 10-inch butcher knife. What followed was a savage attack that would horrify even seasoned detectives. Inside the dining room, just 8 feet from the front door, McCarthy stabbed Dorothy Booth 5 times. She struck her with a heavy candelabrum. Blood spattered the walls. Furniture was overturned as the elderly woman struggled desperately for her life. And then, in a final act of brutality, Kimberly McCarthy severed Booth's ring finger, stealing her diamond wedding ring. She would later pawn that ring for just $200, money spent within hours to feed her addiction. The crime did not stop there. McCarthy stole Booth's purse, her credit cards, and her 1995 Mercedes-Benz. By 2:15 in the afternoon that very afternoon, surveillance cameras at AAA Pawn Shop captured McCarthy pawning the stolen ring. Soon after, she was caught on security footage attempting to use Booth's stolen ATM card 3 separate times to withdraw cash. But fate and technology were closing in. Each failed ATM attempt was recorded, each panic-driven swipe building an ironclad chain of evidence. Meanwhile, next door, Dorothy Booth's body lay undiscovered in her ransacked dining room. At 7:30 in the morning, the following morning, July 22nd, Nend, a neighbor noticed something strange. Dorothy's morning ritual had been broken. For 3 years, she had retrieved her Dallas Morning News at exactly 7:15 in the morning. That day, the newspaper remained untouched. Police were summoned. Inside, they found a scene of horrific violence. Drawers yanked open, bloodstains across the room. Dorothy Booth's lifeless body was found amid the chaos, a crime that would soon shock Lancaster, Texas, and beyond. By July 23rd RD, police executed a search warrant at McCarthy's home. There, they found the evidence that would seal her fate: Booth's blood on the butcher knife, Booth's blood on McCarthy's walls, Booth's credit cards and driver's license in McCarthy's possession. And on July 24th, 1997, Kimberly McCarthy was arrested, still under the influence of cocaine. The arrest was uneventful. No resistance, no final confrontation, only the click of handcuffs. The sound of a life irrevocably changed. From that moment forward, Kimberly McCarthy was no longer an anonymous addict spiraling in silence. She was now a murder suspect. And soon, she would stand trial for capital murder, a charge that carried the possibility of death. But as we shall see, the trial of Kimberly McCarthy would become about more than just one horrific crime. It would expose deep fractures in the American justice system, fractures of race, poverty, and the eternal question: can justice ever truly be blind? Race, jury bias, and the long road to execution. It is often said that justice is blind. But in America, as in many nations, the scales of justice can tilt beneath the weight of history, prejudice, and flawed process. After her arrest on July 24th, 1997, Kimberly McCarthy was charged with capital murder, a crime punishable by death in the state of Texas. Her first trial began in 1998. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, and the stolen property left little room for doubt. The jury found her guilty. She was sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. In 2001, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned McCarthy's conviction, not on questions of guilt, but of procedure. The court ruled that the trial judge had improperly admitted a statement McCarthy made to police after invoking her right to an attorney. Justice, they argued, demanded a new trial. And so in 2022, Kimberly McCarthy stood once more before a jury, this time in a retrial that would become the center of legal controversy for the next decade. At the heart of the matter was jury selection. Of the 12 jurors seated, 11 were white. Only one juror was black, in a county where nearly 23% of residents were African American. 3 of the 4 non-white juror candidates had been struck by the prosecution, a pattern that would later form the backbone of McCarthy's appeals. This practice had deep roots in Dallas County's troubled legal history. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court had ruled against the county in Miller v. Dretke, finding that Dallas prosecutors had long engaged in racially biased jury selection, a practice known as Batson violations. McCarthy's attorney, Maury Levin, argued that this pattern had tainted her own trial. She contended that the prosecution's dismissal of minority jurors, 75% of black candidates, deprived her of the right to a jury of her peers. Further, Levin alleged that McCarthy's prior appellate counsel had provided ineffective assistance, visiting her only once in a decade and failing to challenge the jury selection at trial. As McCarthy's appeals wound through the courts, time passed. In January 2013, her execution was scheduled. But in a rare move, State District Judge Larry Mitchell issued a stay just hours before the appointed time. Why? To allow her legal team to pursue their racial discrimination claims. Even the Dallas County District Attorney, Craig Watkins, supported this delay, an extraordinary gesture from a prosecutor's office. Watkins had publicly called for a Racial Justice Act in Texas, legislation that would allow death row inmates to appeal sentences based on evidence of racial bias. McCarthy's execution was rescheduled for April 3rd, 2013, and delayed once more as lawmakers considered 6 such bills in the Texas legislature. But when that session ended, with no new reforms, her final execution date was set, June 26, 2020. In her final appeals, McCarthy's lawyer filed a detailed brief, citing the statistical bias in jury selection. highlighting that prosecutors had asked different questions of black and white jurors, arguing that two of the appellate judges on her case had once served as Dallas County prosecutors, raising questions of impartiality. The timing was critical. In May 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Trevino v. Thaler, allowing exceptions to Texas's notoriously strict procedural default rules in capital cases. McCarthy's team seized upon this opening, filing new challenges in late June. But on June 24, 2013, just 2 days before her execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected her appeal. They ruled her claims were untimely, that they should have been raised earlier. With that ruling, Kimberly McCarthy's fate was sealed. Yet the questions remained, questions that haunt many such cases. Was this truly a fair trial? In a state with a documented history of racial discrimination and capital punishment, can we be certain that justice was blind? Or had the machinery of death ground forward, indifferent to the deeper flaws in its foundation? Kimberly McCarthy would now face her final hours. And as we shall see, even in those last moments, the shadow of America's imperfect justice system loomed large, inside the death watch. In the cold arithmetic of time, 105 hours is but 4 days and 9 hours, a span easily lost in the rush of ordinary life. But for one woman on Texas's death row, it was an eternity measured not in minutes, but in final chances slipping away. On the morning of Saturday, June 22nd and 20 at 12:01 in the morning, Kimberly McCarthy was officially placed on death watch. Her execution was scheduled for the following Wednesday, June 26th at 6 in the evening. Death watch is a protocol, clinical in its design, yet profoundly human in its effect. The condemned is moved to a special holding cell in the Walls Unit of Huntsville Prison. Their every movement is monitored. They are allowed to bathe. Their belongings are packed. Their final requests were documented. A log of McCarthy's final days would later reveal no dramatic confessions, no last-minute breakdowns. Instead, ordinary acts imbued with extraordinary weight. And she read a book. She ate a peach. She groomed herself, perhaps a small act of dignity in a process designed to strip it away. She packed her personal property. She worked on puzzles, one imagines, perhaps, as a way to quiet the mind in those long, silent hours. Outside her cell, the legal battle raged on. On June 20th, her attorney, Maury Levin, had filed last-minute appeals, citing racial bias in jury selection and ineffective legal counsel. But on June 24th, thus, just 48 hours before execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied her final appeal. And so, by the evening of June 25th, Kimberly McCarthy knew with certainty that her time had nearly run out. On the day of her execution, June 26th, the familiar rituals of state-sanctioned death unfolded. There was no special last meal. Texas had eliminated that option in 2011. Instead, McCarthy was served the standard prison fare: pepper steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, mixed vegetables, and white cake with chocolate icing. As the afternoon waned, she met one last time with those closest to her: her attorney, Maury Levin, her spiritual advisor, Reverend Campbell, her ex-husband, Aaron Michaels, founder of the New Black Panther Party. 3 others, including her son, were expected but did not appear, a small absence that must have weighed heavily in those final moments. At 6 in the evening, McCarthy was escorted to the execution chamber. There, strapped to the gurney, beneath a microphone suspended overhead, she spoke her final words, words that would echo beyond those sterile walls. She said, "This is not a loss. This is a win. You know where I'm going. I'm going home to be with Jesus. Keep the faith. I love you all." And as the single dose of pentobarbital coursed through her veins, her final words, softly spoken, were, "God is great." Witnesses described her final moments: hard, raspy breaths for several seconds, then a minute more as her chest rose and fell, and then stilled. At 6:37 in the evening, Kimberly McCarthy was pronounced dead. She had become the 500th person executed by the state of Texas since 1982, a grim milestone in the history of American capital punishment. And so the final 105 hours came to their inevitable end. A span of time in which life, law, and mortality converged, and a woman once defined by her worst act faced her final moments with a faith unbroken. In the days that followed Kimberly McCarthy's execution, headlines focused on one number: 500. Texas had reached its 500th execution since the reinstatement of capital punishment in 1982, a grim milestone, but one that masks deeper questions. Outside the Walls unit that evening, a small crowd of protesters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Don't kill for me's." Inside, Dorothy Booth's family spoke with quiet dignity. 500 is just a number, her godson said. We're thinking about the justice promised to us.